Mayan Women's Protagonism in the Aftermath of Genocidal Harm by Alison, Crosby and Brinton Lykes. My name is Katie Young. I'm moderating this session, which I'm very excited about. I'm a professor at the law school and work in the intersection of human rights law and comparative constitutional law. And I was delighted to be asked to facilitate. You won't hear much from me, but a little bit. But the main excitement is the panelists, the authors themselves, Brinton Lykes and Alison Crosby, and a commentator, Dr. María, Elena Torre, will be presenting her thoughts on the book. So I thought I'd just give a little spiel and opening for the event, and then I'm going to pass over to Alison Crosby to speak, followed by Brinton Lykes. Then I'm going to say a little bit more about the book from an explicitly lawyer's perspective, and then finally Dr. Torre will speak about the book from her perspective. So let me first open up the book itself. Many of you will be trying to buy this book. It's for sale outside. I've been told that your credit cards, despite being told that they won't work, will actually work. So you can go armed with a credit card, which will then be written down, the number will be written down, and you will be physically able to purchase the book despite the digital transaction not actually working at the moment. So I encourage you to go and buy the book. It's a fabulous book. My copy is already dog-eared. I very much enjoyed reading it. So the book really performs an insurmountable task, and that is the task of how to respond adequately to the atrocities that have been perpetrated on Indigenous communities in Guatemala, particularly on Indigenous women in those communities, particularly in the early 1980s, but following a almost 4-decade-long series of armed conflicts and violence on Indigenous communities, clearly within the context of a very long legacy of colonization and racial and gendered violence. So the book is moving in the direction of achieving a response to this almost insurmountable task. And I want to just say briefly in the introduction, I think this book is an incredibly patient book with a lot of impatience to it. And I want to also say that it's an incredibly humble book with a lot of ambition to it. And what I mean by that is there's an incredible patience presented in this book in dealing with the problem of protagonism, the problem of hearing from Mayan women in their own capacity to express their needs and their demands in a very structured system of responding to atrocities. And there's an incredible patience in listening, in the active arts of listening and the task of listening and the commitment to listening. And I think an impatience with various fields that have been trying to design the listening process, with lawyers from the transitional justice field, with other human rights lawyers, who either have usurped that process of listening and protagonism, or have abdicated on the responsibility to listen because of the impossibilities of the task. So that I think really speaks out in the book's patience and impatience. And also I want to say something just in the opening about the humbleness and the ambition. So it's very humble in its undertaking. In the pages themselves you read of an explicit commitment to epistemic uncertainty, to acknowledging the power and the privilege of North American white women responding to atrocities felt by Indigenous women, and trying to speak to that series of working through reparations, truth and justice to these atrocities. So there's a kind of self-presented modesty, which can be unusual in scholarly commentary when academics tend to center themselves in the story, and that's not done here. At the same time, there's an incredible ambition, the difficulties of the task of really reaching for protagonism, not describing these women as victims or as subjects or even as survivors, but as believing in that goal of protagonism, I think is incredibly ambitious. it's breathtakingly ambitious. So it's a very exciting book. I'll say a little bit more later about the legal take-homes that I could see in the book. I do want to announce that one of our panelists wasn't able to make it to the book talk and launch itself. Dr. Alicia Velasquez Vitu, who has unfortunately had a minor fall yesterday. She traveled today, which she was very unhappy about. She said well wishes to you. She apologized to all of us for not being here. She's someone who was very involved in the trials and the tribunals in Guatemala. I hope we can hear some of her perspectives through other Q&A and other responses, but I did want to announce that she wasn't able to be here. So let me introduce our two authors. First, I don't think either of you need much of an introduction, but Alison Crosby will first speak. Dr. Crosby, who is an associate professor in the School of Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies and the director of the Centre for Feminist Research at York University in Toronto in Canada, who's published incredibly widely in the fields of transnational feminist advocacy and participatory methodologies. She has a series of publications. Her current project looks to both Guatemala and Sri Lanka and explores memorialization as a site of contestation in both those places. So that's her current work, and this is her now past book that we're discussing today. She'll first speak, and then Professor Brinton Lykes will speak, Professor of Community Cultural Psychology here at Boston College, and also the co-director of the Centre for Human Rights and International Justice with Professor Dan Kanstrom. So we'll hear from the authors themselves before we open up to us and then open up to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Katie. And I'd like to thank the Centre for Human Rights and International Justice for organizing this event. And thank you so much to Tim for the logistics and making all this happen, and to Dan and to Brinton for hosting this event, and to Katie and María for giving your time to engaging with this book. And I'm looking forward to hearing more of your comments on the book. And I'm very sorry that Alicia is not with us today, because she's been such a central part of much of the work that we talk about in this book. She's an expert witness in this Sarko trial, in the Tribunal of Conscience, and she's been an invaluable colleague and advisor to us and friend throughout this process. So her absence and her presence are very much felt in this room. And as you'll see if you do buy a copy of the book, no pressure. The acknowledgement section is very extensive, because to do this kind of research requires so many relationships and so many collaborations, and this book goes much beyond either one of us. It brings together so much richness from everyone with whom we engaged, beginning, of course, centrally with the 54 Mayan women protagonists who had the grace to allow us to accompany them in some small way along their journey, and they taught us in the process, in their own words, to fly with large wings, and we've learned so much from them and from all of the intermediaries and organizations who accompanied them for over a decade in this process. So I just wanted to bring into the room everyone who has accompanied us in this journey, and will continue to have those conversations with us as we move forward. I did want to flag that we're currently working on the Spanish version of the book, and it will be coming out. It's being published by the Mayan Press, Josama in Guatemala in July, and we're currently working on a book tour of Guatemala and giving back the book and engaging with everyone with whom we work and others, and I'm looking forward to that next step in this multiple process of engagement. And I just wanted to say thank you to Brinton. We were, to be honest, this morning we were dreading this event. I will just say that. And we were looking forward to the after, but not so much, the event. And we both acknowledge that we find it very hard to celebrate things. I'm a Scot. I'm naturally a pessimist. But it's been, one of the privileges of my life to have been able to work with Brinton in a truly dialogical way. And I've learned so much from her over so many years. I will tell you, because I know there's many friends and colleagues in the room, so I'm going to share something that you may not know, is how we first met. Oh. It wasn't in a small town in Guatemala somewhere or in Guatemala City. It was actually in New York City on an incredibly hot day in July 2016, and it was the World Cup final, soccer. And I'm a total soccer fan. So I made Brinton the first time we met, sit and watch France versus Italy on a hot July day in 2016. So I really, 2006. So that, I was very impressed by her patience, shall we say, to sit and watch a soccer match with me. And she's watched several since then.
She's learned how to call it football.
So anyway, so it's been, there aren't really words to express what it's been like to work with her, but hopefully if some of that comes through in the book as well. So I'm just going to give a bit of a context for some of the research and sort of where we went. And it draws on 8 years between 2009 and 2017 of a feminist participatory action research that we conducted with 54 Mam, Chu, Popti, Kekchi, and Kekchikel women from 3 regions of Guatemala, Huehuetenango, Chimaltenango, and Izabal Alta Verapaz, who had survived sexual violence and other forms of racialized gendered violence during the 1980s at the height of Guatemala's 36-year armed conflict, and who we refer to in this volume as protagonists, as well as the various intermediaries who have accompanied them in their decade-long struggle for redress. And these intermediaries include Mayan, Latinx, and transnational activists, interpreters, feminists, lawyers, psychologists, and researchers, ourselves, of course, included. And Brinton is going to speak a bit more to how we think about this notion of protagonism, as well as intermediarity, and how they surface as central concepts in our research. So this group of 54 protagonists had been working together with accompaniment from a number of local organizations since 2003, including participating in an oral history project documenting their experiences of violence, which was published in 2009. And I had the opportunity to engage with the beginnings of this work in 2003 as part of being a staff member of the Canadian Social Justice Organization in Paris. So I was sort of part of those initial discussions of how this work was going to emerge. And then in 2007, the year after the World Cup final, Brinton and I first worked together in developing and facilitating a workshop with mental health promoters from Guatemala, Peru, and Colombia who are supporting women survivors of sexual violence. So these engagements, including my work with Paris and the workshop, led to us establishing a partnership with the National Union of Guatemalan Women, NAMCE, for this research that we discuss in the book. So our research itself began in 2009 in the context of the creation of the state-sponsored National Reparations Program. And we were interested in particular in what reparation actually meant from the standpoint of Mayan women protagonists. As they themselves told us, the harm that they suffered during the Guatemalan armed conflict is in fact irreparable. It's not possible to repair that harm. But at the same time, they are demanding, indeed insisting, that this harm be redressed. So this was the central tension, in some senses, that we were seeking to explore in this research, between acknowledging the irreparability of harm, but at the same time, the absolute importance of justice and reparation. So the book engages this paradigm of transitional justice, which takes up the principles of truth, justice, reparations, and the guarantee of non-repetition as a means to effect a transition from conflict and authoritarianism to democracy, but really to Western liberal democracy. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So in Guatemala, a range of transitional justice mechanisms have been engaged since the signing of the final peace accords in 1996, beginning with 2 major truth-telling processes, the Catholic Church's Recovery of Historical Memory Project and the UN-sponsored Historical Clarification Commission. And while these reports did take up gendered violence, it was widely acknowledged to be significantly underreported and underexamined, which was the major impetus for the work with survivors, with protagonists that began in 2003, which was to bring gendered, racialized violence and sexual violence as well as war in particular into the public domain, to provide psychosocial accompaniment and healing to survivors, and to support their demands for truth, justice, and reparations. So in the book, we trace protagonists' engagement with a range of transitional justice mechanisms in post-genocide Guatemala, including, firstly, a tribunal of conscience that was held in March 2010, and that's the focus of Chapter 2, recounting protagonism. No one can take this thorn from my soul. And this tribunal was a truth-telling space organized by several Guatemalan civil society organizations in which Mayan women testified, often for the first time, in public space about their experiences. And it was intended to lay the groundwork for a future legal case. And as such, it was structured as a mock trial, with women survivors from Guatemala, Peru, Uganda, and Japan as the judges, and two prominent Guatemalan and Spanish feminist lawyers as the prosecutors. And we participated as honorary witnesses in the tribunal, and Irma Alicia was an expert witness, which is where we first met her, was actually in that tribunal space. So that was the first transitional justice mechanism we documented. The second one, what is the paradigmatic court case of sexual violence as a crime against humanity, which is commonly referred to as the Sacred case, which saw the participation of 15 CHRIJ women from our research project as plaintiffs in the case. And Chapter 3, judicializing protagonism, what will the law say, focuses on the case itself. So the trial took place in February 2016, and two low-ranking members of the Guatemalan military were convicted. And this was the first time that such crimes have been prosecuted in the country in which they took place. Irma Alicia gave evidence as an expert witness in the trial. And in this chapter, and in the book more broadly, we engage with the question of one of the CHRIJ witnesses asked in the trial, when she said, "What will the law say about what happened to us? Will there be justice, or are things going to stay as they are after all of these years that we've suffered?" And that really is the central question that we're thinking about. And then thirdly, we also examined the very contentious national reparations program that's being implemented by the Guatemalan state. And it was created in 2003 after much foot-dragging by successive governments. And we focus on it in Chapter 4, repairing protagonism, carrying a heavy load. And of course, there are many complexities inherent to receiving a check for the experience of sexual harm, which the pioneer of the National Reparations Program often implied was invented by women in order to receive reparations. So the pioneer's inadequacies in addressing the demand for repair engendered deep-seated bitterness. Nos engañaron, they deceived us, was a constant refrain in our research, further articulated by protagonists in statements such as, "It's just to distract, treating you like a child so you don't complain. It's to shut you up, to cover your mouth. It's not right, it's not valid. This government lies. While the government lives happily, we live in poverty." As Indigenous women, they continue to use us through deception. So reading across the book, of particular interest to us is how international feminist and human rights regimes, including the paradigm of transitional justice, can have a tendency to overwrite or occlude Indigenous and place-based struggles for redress. And this is particularly troubled terrain in a context such as Guatemala. And present-day Guatemala continues to be haunted by its centuries-long colonial history of dispossession and violence against its Indigenous peoples. Haunted in Avery Gordon's sense of the past not being past, but as that which lives on in the present, which is in tension with Western linear notions of time and progress. Because an underlying assumption of the transitional justice paradigm is that the transition in question is to Western liberal democracy, which we seek to trouble in this volume. And of course, these questions are further complicated in the current context in Guatemala, where the rule of law is being undermined and powerful elites are seeking to overthrow the very precarious judicial spring in which much of our research took place. So in thinking critically about the role of Western law in justice-seeking processes by Indigenous women, We are, of course, not discounting or underplaying the tremendous work, courage, and commitment by survivors and activists over the past decade to bringing the Sarko case and many, many other cases to trial. As such, we agree with Nicola Henry's caution against both, quote, judicial romanticism, as well as, quote, a hyperbolic dismissal of the law. So we hold both of those in tension. The Sarko trial was, of course, immensely significant in the lives of the 15 CHRIJ protagonists and all those who accompanied them for over a decade. So it's not for nothing that we begin the book with the following quote from Demisya Yat, one of the plaintiffs in the Sarko case and the spokeswoman for Halok Food, which is an organization that the plaintiffs themselves have formed coming out of the trial, and which means transformation or change in CHRIJ. So I just wanted to read her quote because I think it's important to hold on to the significance of the trial. So she's talking about, in the aftermath of the trial, she's talking about its significance. And she says, "We felt happy to see that the court allowed us in, listened to us, especially us women, because we never thought they would grant us that right or give us that space. We thank the judges who listened to us. Then I felt calm, and at the same time, I cried from the effort. I remembered those of us who were there sitting, watching, and listening. When we rejoiced the most is when the judge issued the ruling, because we fulfilled our struggle, and I felt calmer because I heard how many years the culprits were sentenced to serve in jail. When we heard it, or when I heard it, I felt calmer knowing that they will pay for what they did to us." So the Messiah's words remind us of the significance and the impact of the trial in a racist colonial country such as Guatemala. So we argue in the book that justice before the courts within the Western legal system is a necessary, but at the same time not sufficient, component of broader indigenous struggles for redress for colonial violence and dispossession. And one of the things we try to do in the book is to complicate how we think about and represent racialized gendered violence, even in the aftermath of genocidal harm, and particularly how to resist its spectacularization, which is further accentuated in relation to sexual harm. So here we draw on Vinodas's work, when we've sought in the book and in our research to understand how the tentacles of violence reach into the everyday, and how the work of repair must always be situated also within the everyday. So for example, protagonists in our research defined violence against women as carrying the heavy load of impoverishment. They continuously situated their experiences of violence within the structural violence of colonial dispossession and loss of land, livelihoods, and lives. Because at the root of the Sarko case, for example, was the disappearance of the women's husbands who were involved in the struggle to legalize their lands, which were being colonized by corporate interests, which led to the establishment of the Sarko military outpost in that area to protect these corporate interests. So the men were disappeared, and their widows were then subjected to sexual violence and forced labor at the outpost. Protagonists also insisted on not retelling stories of individuated harm, and indeed they made this a condition of their participation in our research. They continuously resisted the spectacle of being seen as the raped woman, including in the Tribunal of Conscience and the Sarko trial, where they wore shawls to conceal their identities. This was in part because of security concerns, but also to resist the spectator's gaze. And indeed, this was provocative for audiences for these public performances of truth and justice, because it disrupted what Wendy Hesford refers to as the ocular epistemology of human rights spectacles, this notion of seeing as believing. So as we explore in chapter 2 of the book, the spectator's inability to see the other and confirm her identity caused great discomfort among many of them, disrupting their authorial privilege to consume the other's pain and their own discursive construction of who is a good victim. So this notion of disrupting authorial privilege, of course, implicates ourselves as white feminist researchers from the global north. And here I'm going to turn it over to Brinton to talk about how we address this in the context of our research, in particular through the question of relationality and reflexivity as articulated in our conceptions of protagonism and intermediate.
Thank you, Alison, and thank you all very much for being here. It's remarkable to actually be in the greater Boston area and have the oldest son of my youngest brother here, who goes to school on the other side of the river, and my oldest childhood friend here, who we've known each other since we were 4. That was many decades ago. Not to mention all the other wonderful friends that have journeyed at different moments of my life and who have heard so much about Guatemala. Many of you have been there, but others of you have tolerated story upon story and angst upon angst of cultivating what Katie referred to so generously as patience. I'm often grateful that I grew up in New Orleans and not in Massachusetts, because life is a little slower in the South. Some of that slowness, I think, is wonderful. And that certainly was an important orientation to bring into rural communities in Guatemala. And there's no way to trump Alison's wonderful commentary, although I will add that I have noticed more and more that very few people write monographs as co-authors. And I don't know how many co-authors actually still have friendships at the end of that journey. And it's been a remarkable opportunity to be on that journey together. And also, it's an intergenerational journey. I continue to learn. Mentoring is often thought of as somebody who's older mentoring someone who's younger. It's really a mutual association of mentorship, and it's a great opportunity to be able to experience that. And I actually thank Gabi Oliveira for being up here today, because although I am her official mentor, I would never have thought of having a book presentation before I met her, who just published her own book earlier this year. So thank you all for being here. Now I'm going to start, as Alison said, by talking a little bit about disrupting authorial privilege, which is rather ironic since we're sitting in front of you as co-authors of a monograph. But this, I think, as Katie suggested in her eloquent and very generous introduction, was of central importance to us as we thought about this project and as we thought about journeying together in, for each of us, new projects in Guatemala in the wake of the 36-year armed conflict there. And that is in large part because it implicates us as white feminist activist scholars from the global north in very particular ways. As some of you know, and as Carla Nicholson, who's here today, knows more intimately than others, I've been on a journey of trying to deconstruct my white racist privilege and white supremacy for many decades. And this work in Guatemala is another dimension, another aspect of that journey, and one in which one cannot fall into sort of self-searching solipsism and flagellation, but rather needs to roughly put one foot in front of the next, as many Mayan women say, and go roughly forward. That recognition has been critical to our own work as we continue to be informed by and resisting our location of white and class privilege within settler colonial context, both here in the United States and in Canada. And one of the ways in which we tried to do that is to draw on a resource that has been identified by feminist scholars and many other scholars, and that is what some call critical reflexivity. That is the ways in which we as researchers from the global north, have sought to deconstruct our own underlying assumptions that we bring into activist scholarship and to acknowledge the hegemonic privilege that undergirds who we are in the world, despite or in the midst of that anti-racist and anti-colonial positioning. With this in mind, we partnered with, as Alison mentioned, UNAMHE, a local Guatemalan feminist organization. As we note, these women were engaged in ongoing actions in their search for truth, justice, and reparations, with a particular focus at the time of this partnership on reparations. And we propose to accompany their actions and to create a space for reflection. Not just reflection with the Mayan women, but reflection with the feminists, the psychologists, and the lawyers who were engaged in accompanying them. In that process, we drew heavily on the language of Sally Engel Mary, a feminist anthropologist and legal scholar, and her work in feminist transnational scholarship. And we talk about ourselves and our Latinx colleagues as intermediaries. Mary defines an intermediary as a person in the middle, someone who translates the discourses and practices from the arena of international law, legal institutions, and in our case, feminist scholarship, into specific situations of suffering and violation, and that work at various levels to negotiate between local, regional, and global systems of meaning. She and her co-authors have written extensively about how people, most particularly women, often appropriate human rights discourse and practices in innovative ways, translating them into praxis that moves beyond local agendas. We have been particularly interested in drawing on this work in what she also calls vernacularization, but rather to focus on what the Mayan women themselves were articulating, to cultivate listening and to examine how that knowledge is transformed in a journey up, and to what extent and in what ways are those of us from outside that arena willing to accompany and move forward in the actions and priorities of Mayan women. And this is a deeply complex and deeply contradictory place to position oneself. In order to do that, as Alison suggested, we eschewed the language of victim and we eschewed the language of survivor, and rather adopted a conception that emphasizes the dialogic dimensions of all knowledge construction through praxis. That is an action-reflection process through which a multiplicity of actors co-construct meaning and move towards transformative possibilities. The concept of protagonism as we have embraced it comes to represent the person in context, and it invokes a Greek chorus within the theater that is the dialogic rather than the individuated voice, drawing on the call and response from African American religious contexts here in the United States. We explore how Mayan women position themselves vis-a-vis other women who are Mayan and in their communities, men in those communities, and others who have accompanied them, including ourselves. And we strived for mutual relationality and an empathetic dialogical co-constitution of their protagonism. Our work recognizes two levels of struggle identified and discussed by the CHRIJ scholar Irma Orthoy, who wrote, and I quote, "Congruent and incongruent with the lived experiences of indigenous women today is the socially and culturally intertwined struggle for the exercise of collective rights and for the enjoyment of individual rights." In her analysis of justice-seeking processes among the Maya, she examines the ways in which indigenous peoples' engagement with community and with Mayan customary laws in situ reflects their concern with, and I quote, "the effective functioning of the social order, while women's struggles for justice in the wake of sexual violence are more focused on individual needs, feelings, voice, and dignity." Now, how did we go about doing this? We drew heavily on the primary methodological resource of participatory and action research, as that work was infused by creativity, critical engagement, our own anti-racist feminism, and Mayan beliefs and practices. We had the good fortune to have known during our years in Guatemala the Mayan women's group CACLA, to have worked with another group called Médicos Descalzos, as well as other local theater groups, including those from Peru who have worked frequently in Guatemala and have deployed embodied praxis through critical and engaged performances, not only of suffering, but of resistance and of dialogue within and beyond local communities. These processes were developed in the Global South, and they are familiar to many rural communities through teaching, learning, community-based health and mental health work. Thus, we entered an ongoing practice in which Guatemalan intermediaries and Mayan protagonists were already taking up actions, and we sought to create a reflective space for documenting that work and for co-constructing knowledge together. We have deployed, therefore, a commitment to identifying racialized gender as an analytic tool to locate and frame these social issues and to problematize them. We look intersectionally to make visible the interlocking power of gender and race and sexuality and social class that deeply informs and constrains the knowledge developed herein. These workshops were designed to offer resources that resonated with and enhanced the women's cultural, linguistic, and educational capacities to address some of the effects of these experiences of violence. We facilitated, as Alison mentioned, multiple workshops not only with them, but with the intermediaries who were accompanying them. And I'd like to just read you a couple of excerpts from that work, just to give you a sense of how they thought about these creative processes. We felt like they generated a more explicit set of references to the embodied nature of violence that these women experienced. At one point, they talked about how soldiers raped them and how it continued to affect their health. They frequently mentioned the ever-present past in their drawings and in their dramatizations. And I quote, "Women remain ill over a long period of time, but no one gives them the attention they strive for." The affective dimensions of loss and harm were a constant motif in these workshops. Protagonists referred to their fear and their sadness and their sense of isolation. "This is how we were found," they said. "We did not look at each other, we did not understand what was happening, we couldn't talk, and nobody listened to us. We wanted to talk, we wanted to relieve our suffering. It was a lump in our throat." But over time and over the years and over the multiple experiences that Alison referred to, women began to think about and to talk about these reparations through collages and through image theater performances as an opportunity to express their protagonism within and across their ethno-linguistic communities. Protagonism that was engendered by their engagement in collective struggles for truth, justice, and reparations. The intersection of justice and reparation-seeking efforts was reflected in the court system and in the tribunal, but it came out in different ways as women dramatized and defended their workshop performances. One of them said, "We are organizing to demand that they listen to us, and we're analyzing our histories during the past to demand our rights in the present. We're mobilizing to let the government know what our demands are." They performed activism in the constrained space of a creative workshop to practice what it would look like beyond the borders of the creative workshops. And one noted, "We are demonstrating and creating that women's committees can form in our own communities." So these women created a community of women at the same time that they reclaimed their spaces in their communities of origin or in their local geographic spaces. Through centering and foregrounding the knowledges of community of women in local Mayan communities, while documenting the co-construction of what we can know from our positioning alongside but separate from them in their multiple communities, we seek to contribute to an intersectional feminist practice of what Gloria Andalzúa calls nosotras, and to the transformative potential of what the Oaxacan activist Gustavo Esteva calls commoning towards the future. Thank you.
So that concludes the comments from the authors themselves, and now we're going to move to a set of reflections of my own and Maria's, and then we'll open it up to you, the audience. So I'm going to offer some reflections on my discipline, law, and yet I have to say that this book has so much to offer other disciplines, so forgive me on the lens that you're about to hear. So this is an astonishingly fruitful book for particular legal mechanisms and then general legal mechanisms. So particularly for the transitional justice mechanisms that have been set up to respond to mass atrocities and human rights violations. There's so many important lessons, and I know lessons learned is not the methodology that you want, but there are clear messages given about the insistent need to listen and to actively listen and to use various methods to engage in that listening. So Brinton's just talked about the use of art, Alison too, the use of intermediaries. This is not a kind of straightforward linear process that they're describing that transitional justice mechanisms sometimes adopt, but a series of different engagements over a long period of time that really unearth and surface expressions of demands and expressions of needs. And I think traditional transitional justice mechanisms find very hard to hear and to find. And what this has led them to see is that there are calls for demands in economic justice beyond the kind of symbolic responses that transitional justice systems from South Africa and other places have called for. So the field itself of transitional justice has moved slowly but surely to recognize the material dimensions of compensation. You know, all these problems of, as Alison mentioned, the kind of symbolic harm in itself of awarding material compensation for an atrocity, of paying off a victim or somehow signaling that the victim is now complicit in that payoff or co-opted by that payoff, whether it's some money or housing or land. But I think this book really, in calling forth the expressions from the protagonists, lays out a series of reparations that transitional justice mechanisms need to move toward. And so they're documented instances of land, housing, healthcare, and other forms of compensation, and how the protagonists call forth these demands. The challenge, of course, is the implementation side of things, but at least these expressions come from the protagonists themselves. These kind of top-down counting of dollars that could respond to this atrocity. So there's a lot to be said to the field of transitional justice in this book. But there's so much else to be said for broader legal mechanisms. So I was thinking clearly about criminal justice mechanisms in general. The clear message in this book really moves beyond incarceration as the paradigm of accountability and moves to look to alternative forms of accountability through these kinds of payments by the perpetrator. Often they declare themselves bankrupt, but nevertheless you see these really innovative forms of holding perpetrators' accountability that go beyond locking them up. Public recognition, also a different form of recognition to perpetrators who've been inside a community and continue to inhabit that community, and those that are outside that community. And the kind of repercussions for the design of our criminal justice system, clearly in responding in Indigenous people's context, but even broader contexts than that, are very significant. I would also say, thinking about property law, there are so many messages here in this book about how former dispossessions and displacement configure new forms of violence and harm, the kind of structural violence that saw itself enacted through sexual violence, but also other forms of family and community violence and gender violence. Finds a kind of point in property law and the colonial acts of dispossession that have messages for how we design property reparations, land restitution as a critical part of redress, and the need for property systems to be configured to be open to that form of redress. And then generally our system of adversarial justice that we think about, both in terms of the fact-finding trial itself and the forms of the remedies that our adversarial justice system can provide. So in fact-finding, as Alison recounted, there are all these interesting ways and very problematic ways that adversarial justice constructs the victim and requires the victim to deliver on a spectacle, to recount their testimony even though it's deeply traumatic to do so, and to be public, this idea that a trial has to be public and the victim, especially victims of sexual assault and sexual violence, have to then reenact that violence. And this book, I thought, found really innovative ways to get around that spectacle and to actually insist that this spectacle was not a requirement of the justice of the justice and the witnesses moving towards that justice, that their visibility was not a necessary part of adversarial justice. Also in the remedies, so that's the kind of fact-finding side of things, that in the remedies that we think in terms of adversarial justice systems in general, remedies that really respond to structural violence do open out in multiple ways and aren't singly, single-track remedies that we can think about. You walk home with your monetary compensation or so on. And here we hear that land and education and health and various forms of memorializing were encountered in the demands of the protagonists and sought to be delivered upon. And so in one section we read about the health minister promising a health center in the community, acts to improve local schools, including including changing the curricula in middle school to respond to the case itself, and also then setting up different recourses for land claims. And these are remedies that aren't in the realm of the impossible, but are very much in the realm of the possible. So in my field, in economic and social rights law, which is a branch of human rights law that seeks to find remedies for the right to healthcare or the right to housing or the right to education. There's so much in this book that opens up the way of seeking out those remedies. And then finally, I just want to speak not from the legal mechanisms point of view, but from the point of view of human rights law and human rights campaigning. There seems to be, well, there are a lot of paradigms for human rights campaigning. I guess community lawyering would be one paradigm which helps lawyers weave themselves into communities to advocate for them. But I think this book really sets up a whole set of new possibilities beyond community lawyering as a method that lawyers can use. So already it's moved beyond a kind of individualized client model of lawyering. But here I think this book is moving beyond a kind of structural impact litigation. You know, you take cases that are going to have the most impact, and that has become a quite influential way of understanding the Indo-American human rights system. But this book offers, I think, so much more in how lawyers can work with other intermediaries to work with protagonists to formulate claims. I think this concept of protagonism is critical to the structuring of these kinds of human rights campaigns. So I'll stop there. I hope that wasn't too much a lessons learned, but they were my lessons learned. But let me open it up now to Dr. María Torre, who's a research scientist, the director and co-founder of the Public Science Project, and has been engaged in critical participatory action research projects here in the United States and internationally, projects involving schools and prisons and community-based organizations seeking to further social justice. She's worked to introduce the concept of participatory contact zones, which she's telling me to stop, but this is
you got the long email. It's a short one.
I'm not going to go, okay, I'll stop there and let her speak.
Hi, so I'm María Elena Torre. I teach at the City University of New York, and I was just going to open by saying it's really just really lovely to be here. Thank you, Timothy, for all of your work trying to corral me in my ridiculous, terrible email response rates, and it's just really lovely. I was a graduate student when I first met Brinton in 19. I think I don't remember, maybe 96 or 7, something like that. And I had the good fortune of being, at that time, a student of Suzanne Willette, who herself had a really wonderful and very special student, who was fundamental to sort of the scholar that Suzanne became, and that I became, and in many ways that Brinton became. And so, so very early in my very first year, I think, I met Brinton because Suzanne brought her to campus, and she spoke in our class about the work she was doing. I think maybe that was like, you know, early seeds of things that came about in this book. And she and her work at that time became a pillar in my very first doctoral exam. So from the very beginning, a person who never thought she would land at the academy found a home in Brinton. So it's very special to be here and now to meet her new family and all of the family they've created together with the women they work with. So let's see. Just a few more words about who I am to understand sort of the lenses that I bring to this. By the time you're going to be really sick of who I am, but I'm a granddaughter in a Spanish immigrant family from Galicia, which is an autonomous region with its own language that was dominated by the Catholic kings of what we now call Spain. I grew up now, to my family's knowledge, dismissed in the face of thick accents, and in many ways, this and my years later as a youth worker here around Boston and Revere and in Somerville, and later in New York City, led me to find a home not only in Brinton's early writings, but in liberation psychology and in regulatory action research, eventually building what we now call the Public Science Project at the City University of New York. At the Public Science Project, we play and provoke sort of the notion of science. We demand that it can be a public enterprise, that it's a call for social science to engage in struggles for justice. I have to confess, in the last few weeks leading up to our gathering here, have been a bit rough for me. On a personal level, I had a cousin that I care for succumb to another round of seizures. It had been 3 years since she had them. Her tests had been great, and the neurologist encouraged her to wean off her medication. So it turns out a month and 6 seizures later, she wasn't ready. Watching her body seize up and seemingly leave what I knew to be living was a wildly terrifying experience. On a professional level, the last few weeks presented an epic struggle in our program against the continued dominance of positivism and the most narrow imagination of science that has gripped my university. Our program was finally granted a faculty line, the first in 20 years. For those of you who are academics, it's a big deal. We're a public university, we're very underfunded. And we had made a call for a scholar that, in the language of our own university, does public-facing work, right? What we got, or was trying to be rammed down our throats, was a statistician whose work specializes in big data, the scraping of cell phones to analyze text for language of anxiety and depression in order to predict potential terrorism. It's great, he told us. You can know if they're in the library or in the cafeteria, right? We were told this was public-facing work. I won't go on with these examples or even hint at the latest set of national or global outrages, but I share this to say that the questions of tension and purpose and an inability to focus have been looming large in my head. And it was with these eyes that I read this beautiful volume that Alison and Brinton have gifted us. It was with these eyes that I found myself deeply appreciative of the careful work they did to present their collaborative work with the 54 Mayan women protagonists and the intermediaries that accompanied them for the last 8 years. I want to share a few thoughts about what they offered me, and I think the world, in these last few weeks as I traveled spaces that felt upside down. Alison and Brinton took nothing for granted. As you've heard, they interrogated their own positionality as white feminist northern academics. They refused static essentialist representations of their colleagues. They questioned assumptions embedded in the various justice frameworks and methods that they collectively employed, laying out for us all the ways that these methods and these approaches and these frameworks, even when well-intentioned, can reproduce the colonizing white supremacist dynamics and practices that we are all trying to undo. But even as they detail these troubles, they are not paralyzed with them. They offer them as a set of productive tensions. Recently, I was at a workshop and I was asked to hold my 2 hands close together to find the space between touching and not. Anybody ever done this? No. You should try it sometime. I was skeptical, as I'm someone who preaches and sings the chorus of embodied methodologies, but I myself don't always love them. More tensions and hypocrisy and contradiction. So we were asked to hold our hands, and you're supposed to hold them so that they're sort of as close as you can, but they're not touching. So she said, hold them still and you'll feel the energy between them. Sure enough, it was there. It felt like my hands were simultaneously trying to pull into each other and push each other away. There was almost a heat produced by their push-pull tension. It wasn't really comforting, and it took some work, but the feeling lingered, or has lingered with me. It lingered in the emergency room, in the fiery arguments with my administration, in the pages of Beyond Repair. It's not just a feeling, like feeling tense, but it's a realizing the presence of a tension. And that perhaps is a piece of our collective work as sort of justice researchers. In their analysis of the aftermath of the genocide, and particularly of the protagonism of the 54 women and their intermediaries, heard a little bit about them, I won't repeat them, but the tensions that are created by the so-called universal discourse of human rights, transitional justice frameworks, right? The insistence on reparations and justice, as if healing is possible, and yet women saying, you know, they're even talking about healing activities, and yet simultaneously saying this will never be healed. So to be wanting and desiring both of those kinds of things. And I think at this particular moment, and if I apologize, I'm just starting to use reading glasses, and so I look up at you and you're all just a blur. But I think in this particular moment, this is really, really important work, right? So whether you've been to Guatemala, whether you've ever met these women or not, the dynamics that are talked about in these pages help us understand dynamics that worldwide we're trying to wrestle with, right? So Brinton talked about this idea of nosotras that Gloria Zaldúa offered up to us several years ago before she died, and it's been a concept that I've found very useful over the years. Folks know what nosotras? You know the word nosotras means we, right, in Spanish. Well, Gloria was a poet and literary scholar, and was clever enough to sort of point out that in nosotras, in the Spanish word nosotras, is nos, meaning we, and otras, meaning others, right? So she said that she had this sort of idea, and actually she didn't write a whole lot about this. She talked about it in interviews, but she didn't get a chance to really write about it before she died. So she talked about that there should be a hyphen. In her use of nosotras, there was a hyphen in between, right? And that hyphen held the tension. It held the tension between us and other that is always implicit in a we. It highlights all kinds of structural inequalities, right? All kinds of positionalities that are actually oppositional, right? That are structured. She also talked about growing up in the borderlands on the Texas-Mexico frontera. She talked about what it means to sort of come into a consciousness that sees from multiple perspectives, not just like all sort of equal perspectives that have been valued differently because of history, culture, politics, power. Right? And she talked about how that over time, our our constructions of these sort of essential selves, the colonizer and the colonized, right? The people in power, the people without power, that those, while important politically to sort of analyze power, that the lived experience is a lot more complicated, right? That our lives really are fairly intermingled, even in extreme power imbalances, so that the oppressor and the oppressed kind of, in her words, leak into each other, right? We go to school together, we're served by each other, we're doing all kinds of things where we're coexisting. And in that coexistence, we're taking each other's language, we're borrowing pieces of each other, and those pieces are becoming part of ourselves, right? So that there isn't this pure us, or pure self, pure other, that those kinds of categories fall apart. And I think what's interesting about, or what I'm offering to you anyways, in my crazy state the last few weeks, is that this volume offers a sort of methodology, a way of enacting this idea of nosotras, right? Brinton and Alison have been very, very careful about lifting up the experiences of these women, both the violations that they've experienced, sexual violence, the violence of poverty and colonization, and the extended legacy of colonization, right? Of structural racism, and structural marginalization, that they've held, that is not their only story, right? These are women who are actors in the world, they're women who have families and children, who are creating, who have joy. They're complex women, and they hold that beautifully, although I have to say, every now and then I just wanted to know more about them. They're always referred to as the protagonists. And the 54 women, even though their words are laced throughout the text. And while I appreciated very much politically the intention behind the protagonists, I did find myself yearning to know them as individuals and women as part of a collective. And I have confidence that is in pieces that led to this, right? So when you read this, one of the gifts that it gives you is that it encourages you, it excites you to actually dig into their other papers that they've written a lot with these women. So it's kind of like it's a gift and an invitation all at once. And my sense is that it will continue to grow because there's so much richness here that you read it with, and you're left with a yearning. You're left with an urgency, like we talked about, but you're left with a yearning. And that was one of them. What else did I want to share with you? Well, I think I'll kind of wrap up soon, but I think just to step back again to this notion of this idea that, so even though this is not a methods text at all, they're so explicit about the ways they engaged their colleagues, not just in terms of being very aware of people's positioning and the sort of inequalities that were creating their relationships, and their positions to those inequalities that were also, both sort of constituting them, but also constituting or creating the solidarity that they were building together. So these new forms of coming together. I lost my train of thought. That's what happens when I leave the page. All right. Well, the other gift that it really contributes, I think, to all of us is to think about the ways in which engaging the body, engaging the arts and creativity opens up spaces to understand dynamics in ways that words can never fully do. And they walk a very careful path of both engaging in those activities and then sort of theorizing them. So they let the words go and then they revisit the words, but their revisiting them is forever changed. And so I know that might sound a little abstract, but it's a truth, and when you read it, you can see how that happens. I guess a last thought that I had, and this is more getting back to some of those yearnings, is to think about the ways in which this text will travel when they go back to Guatemala and share it with the women that they co-created it with. There are many places here where this new sense of community that was built over these years through the workshops, through the space, the sort of the gift of the space to reflect, where it wasn't about proving harm, where it wasn't about trying to make sense of how one demands justice over something which will never be repaired. To open up a space for not just reflection, but for being connected to one's body, to being connected to a community of other women, to being in an international community. They go through great pains to talk about the desire not to reproduce colonial frameworks and dynamics, but I think sometimes they tread too lightly on what they're opening up together. And particularly again now where we're being told repeatedly that these kinds of solidarities can't really exist, right? That these kinds of solidarities are so fraught that really we need to stick to our groups and stick to our categories and pretend and have amnesia over the fact that most of our justice struggles have actually been very intersectional forever, right? Civil rights movement was always an interracial movement in some levels. All with the women's movement was multiracial in all different ways. There has never been a movement of people that have been just that little group only acting on themselves, right? But that's sort of a fantasy. It can be a useful fantasy to get movements going, but that's kind of a fantasy. And right now, where we're being told over and over that we are so polarized, that there's such deep inequalities that we can no longer truly, authentically connect with each other, I think that their work is a wonderful reminder that these spaces can be created, that we need to most certainly, work power and discuss the ways that we have been systematically structured, in ways that our inequalities have formed the ways that we relate to each other, the ways that we live in the world, but that these are not things that we can't, as we are undoing and resisting and reimagining them, that we can forge relationships as part of that process. So I leave you with that, and thank you.